Amy and I want to welcome you to this presentation about the early signs of learning differences. At Shelton, we have been working since the early 1970s using Montessori applied to children at risk for learning differences. So in our early childhood classrooms with children 3, 4, 5, and some 6 years of age, we are watching very carefully for their signs of typical development, and we are moving in to help them with strategies that would help them have as typical development as possible. So we're excited to share that information with you today because it can be a really life-changing experience for a child to be successful in school rather than unsuccessful. So we are going to leave in just a few minutes, and you are going to be watching a video that Amy and I created. Amy, will you tell everybody how they can, about our question and answer process?
Absolutely. Well, COVID should not stand in the way of getting this information across. Usually, this was a live presentation in our beautiful Shelton home. Instead, what we've done is pre recorded it to allow for you to ask questions as you're watching the recording of the presentation. What's nice about that is in previous years, we would only be able to have about 5 minutes at the end of the presentation for a Q&A. This is actually a gift of COVID because as you're watching, I'm going to be managing the chat box and answering some of your questions along with Dr. Pickering. So feel free to ask questions as you go along. At the end, we will come back live because we will have selected a few of those kind of frequently asked questions or some good questions that were posed and be able to pose it to the entire group and answer them so that you can get to feel for what some of those questions were and what the answers are. And then without further ado, we're ready, Kyle, for you to play the video.
Good morning, and welcome to this presentation today from Shelton School and Evaluation Center. Early signs of learning differences and how to respond. So Amy Kelton and I are going to talk about the Shelton program and what we do here at Shelton to start with children who are showing early signs of being at risk for a learning difference. Because the earlier you start, the more you can help a child, as we are going to show in this presentation. My name is Dr. Joyce Pickering, and I'm Executive Director Emerita of Shelton. I was the Executive Director for 20 years, and after leaving that position, moved into our outreach to give workshops and conferences and teacher training. I am a speech language pathologist, a COUT, QI, and certified by the American Montessori Society in early childhood. Amy, would you like to tell a little bit about yourself?
I'm Amy Kelton Kushner. I am currently the head of Upper Elementary at Shelton School, which is grades 3rd through 5th, and also the associate head of school. I'm trained in Montessori Elementary 1, and I also have a COUT and QI in the program called Sequential English Education, which is a written language remediation program for children with reading disorders. I've been at Shelton now going into my 27th year and have had the beauty to be mentored by Dr. Joyce Pickering.
So the programs that we use at Shelton for early education are the Montessori educational method, which is a medical scientific pedagogy created by Dr. Maria Montessori. And we here combine it with all kinds of multisensory structured language strategies so that we have both pedagogies working together to help the child be as successful as possible in those early formative years. When we talk about learning, we always have to start with our brain, the organ with which we learn. So everyone knows we have a left hemisphere, and it primarily processes auditory information and language. We have a right hemisphere whose primary responsibility is to process spatial information and abstract thought. And then there are large areas of the brain called lobes. And on this graphic, you can see these are colored in. The brain is actually about 3 pounds in weight and is a pinkish gray color. Here, the temporal lobe is colored blue, so it stands out. This is where we interpret auditory signals and get meaning from language. The occipital lobe, the very back of the brain, interprets all visual sensory input. The parietal lobe at the top of our brain is for bodily sensation perception and also for motor planning. Looking at this brain and seeing these areas touching each other helps us to understand why multisensory learning is so important. These areas have to integrate information. And then in the frontal lobe, at the very front of the brain behind our forehead, this information is organized and prioritized so that we can utilize it. The brain processes in this way. We get sensory inputs. This sensory input are our only ways to bring information from the world around us into the brain. So if we are alert and attending to a sensory input and become aware of it, then our brain starts to interpret, process, figure it out. What am I seeing? What am I hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting? From the brain's processing, we get a percept or a perception, which is just a sensory impression that the brain has received. When we attach language to that perception, then we have a language concept. And sustained attention and language help anchor our memories. If all of this processing is going typically and smoothly during the first 5 years of life, then a child is prepared and ready for the processing they will have to do in the elementary program. So they're ready for higher cognitive functions like reading, writing, spelling, mathematics, and the other subjects. If the child has processing with dysfunctions, this process is different. The brain of a person who is at risk or diagnosed with a learning difference is not abnormal, and it is not damaged. It does dysfunction, which means sometimes it processes the information correctly, and other times it processes the very same information incorrectly. So the sensory input is the same for this child, but the brain's processing can be inaccurate. And when that perception is inaccurate, often language is attached to the wrong perception. And we often see language weaknesses in the vocabulary. And so in addition to these processing difficulties, about 70% of children have some difficulty with attention. And so if there's faulty attention and there's language weaknesses, we often have inadequate memory storage, and working memory. So over the first 5 years of life, if the child is experiencing these processing dysfunctions, then the foundational information that they are learning from the world around them has gaps. And they're not totally ready for the higher cognitive functions as the typically developing child. This is Montessori's 4 planes of development. Montessori looked at child development as a medical doctor and looked at the formation of each one of these planes. So from birth to 6 is the first plane, from 6 to 12, the second, 12 to 18, the third, and 18 to 24, the fourth plane. And at 24, the human brain is fully mature. You can see that this graphic is very linear and geometric. On each one of the planes, there is the first half of the plane for intense change, and the second half is a slower pace consolidation of information. This is for the typical child. We're looking at the planes of development for a typically developing child. And typically developing just means that the majority or average child matures in this way. For the child who is at risk for learning differences, we have drawn wavy lines on each one of the planes because Montessori says, and we observe, that children are not developing this information equally. They are having uneven development in which some areas are proceeding to mature quicker than others. And because of this, the child is having difficulty with some of the learning that they are asked to do, even starting in pre-K and K. So between birth and 3, coordination, language, speech, attention, and perception are developing along separate tracks. So one area might be more mature or developed than another. But by 3, for the typically developing child, most of these are equal in development, which allows the child to integrate these major systems which are necessary for learning. And that integration is leading to their IQ, their intellect, their executive functioning, the ability to organize, prioritize, and their emotional quotient, or their ability to read verbal and nonverbal cues and get along with others and communicate with others. So Dr. Sylvia Richardson said in a lecture in 1987 that if we would identify these children that are at risk, we would look at these major systems: coordination, the motor development of a child, language and speech, attention, and perception. So typical motor coordination development milestones are from the early weeks, the child, some at birth and some a little later, are able to raise their head. From 3 to 4 months, children usually turn over. At 6 months, they can sit up without being propped. At 9 months, they crawl. At 10 to 11 months, they pull up on furniture and cruise around holding on. And at 12 months, most children take their first steps. Some do these milestones a little earlier, some a little later, and some have delays. So motor development is from the head to the tail in our control of our body, and from the midline of our body out. Atypical motor coordination development. Atypical means not typical. It's different than the average milestones.
So as Joyce mentioned, atypical would be the antithesis then of typical. When we looked at typical development of the young child, it was so specific in its codification of this happens at this age, and this happens at this age, and we can expect this at this age. What's beneficial for us is to have that codification so that we can compare it to the atypical child, which is one who doesn't meet those ages and stages, that is slow to walk, slow to crawl, slow or delayed in sitting up. They may even have an awkward pincer grasp when they first go to want to start to grab things. Poor trunk or core stability. This would be the child who may not even like to lay on their tummy very much because that requires strength to push up. What this can look like as the child progresses from birth to 3 then is a motor incoordination, stumbling, almost what I would say that toddler walk that looks very disjointed, lasting much longer past the toddler stage. The Montessori method was designed to meet the milestones of child development. So of an educational pedagogy, imagine one that is grounded in child development and not in the rationale of you need to learn this and you need to learn this, and a curriculum about learning tasks versus about what comes natural in human development. What we do in the Montessori pedagogy is to recognize that an at-risk child is going to have these delays. And the remedy, the remediation for these delays is to be very specific and thoughtful in how we approach treating these delays. So as you can see in this first picture, a child walking around carrying a tray and one pink cube on top of it. This is an activity that is specifically designed to teach the child how to hold something and at the same time integrate the balance and visual spatial awareness required to just walk around the room. The work of this child is walking with care, balance, and thoughtfulness. And the second picture is transforming into more of a fine motor activity. But as you can see, the child is needing that eye-hand focus directly taught. And this last picture shows the child that no matter if something is more contained within your midline or stretched much further, there's a specific way in which we can train how to carry that object in an environment. Now imagine a school environment that would direct teach to this specific need instead of assumptives.
So the motor development that we've just talked about is the foundation of everything that comes after. And sometimes in schools, we don't give enough attention to that motor development. Typical language and speech development. Well, between birth and 3 months, children communicate with us by crying and little cooing sounds. So the crying can be very different and send different messages from when the child is uncomfortable to when the child is in pain. The little cooing sounds are just the child learning that they can make sound. From 3 to 6 months, children start babbling. And that's just bouncing around on sound. Ba, 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 da, da, da. It's not words. It doesn't have any meaning. It's the child practicing moving their teeth, tongue, and lips, their speech musculature, and making sound. From 6 to 9 months, they mature a little further into a stage called echolalia, echoing sounds, echoing words. So if we say ba, 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 and they're looking at our mouth, you'll see sometimes in this stage, they start to imitate and say ba, ba, ba. And then between 10 months of age and 12 months, they say their first words in a typically developing child for speech language. Some do this a little earlier, some do it a little later. But the vocabulary between birth and 5 develops just exponentially every day. And by the time the child enters the first grade, minimally, they would have 2,500 to 5,000 words in their vocabulary. Some children in the first grade have between 14 and 16,000 words with which to communicate. Atypical development of the language center of the brain looks like this. This is a child that when you compare it to those typical milestones, isn't achieving at the same rate. So slow to say their first word doesn't necessarily occur within a reasonable window of around 12 months. This would also be a child beyond 12 months who is maybe pointing at objects instead of using their expressive language to name what they want. Language is a receptive and expressive process, receptively taking in what the words mean, expressive, being able to use your vocabulary to glean meaning to others or to be able to communicate what you want or need. So a child who pulls you and wants to show you something versus telling you or pointing. You can also see in their expressive language the child whose syntax or grammar development is delayed, in which they're not speaking in sentences or logical sequential phrases. They're using pronouns like me, go there, much later in a stage instead of I am going there or I went there. Receptively on the receptive child side, this would be a child who I would say looks at you and nods, but his eyes or her eyes are very wide open. They are struggling with understanding what you are saying. They may even reject being read to because your words don't bring meaning in their world. Montessori at its base knew that language development between birth and 6 years old is considered a critical period in human development. The first lessons that we show a child are always silent, void of any vocabulary, so that the child may observe and watch our hands as we're working with the objects. Then the child gets an opportunity to use his or her own hands to manipulate the materials and replicate what you showed through motor. Once the motor process has been established, we now are going to take that perception and add language so that we can make it a concept. And it's done through Montessori's 3-period lesson. You'll see on this slide those similar words I just used of receptive and expressive language. So the first stage, we are merely labeling. This is a. So let's do that pretend with the pink cube that the child was carrying. This is a cube. You would then ask the receptive language piece. Show me the cube. It is a nonverbal response that is required. The child merely touching it or pointing to it. And then the expressive is kind of the piece de resistance. Can they recall the label when I do the pointing? What is this? Most often they'll say, a cube. We like to model correct syntax or grammatical structure and say, this is a cube. Imagine as you look at this environment around me, right behind me. This is a model Montessori classroom that we use for training purposes. You see numerous materials. And for each material, we very diligently introduce the language of that activity, never to assume that they have it. Oral language, then, is the basis for written language. So typical development of written language, which would include reading and spelling. The child develops the ability to localize sounds in words so that they can hear not only the word we are saying, but each discrete sound in the word. And they develop sound symbol correspondence. If it's presented to them, or if letters are introduced and sounds are made, they begin to put this information together and become more and more automatic on them. The child then develops the ability to blend sounds into words, and blending sounds is not an easy step. By about 8 years, the child is fluent in their decoding and comprehends what they read. And the student then continues to increase his reading accuracy and rate. Encoding or spelling follows the same process.
So atypical development of reading and spelling. But what we know is in that first slide that Joey showed about reading and spelling in the typical child, it seemed like a broader range for when reading or an interest in decoding would start. And that would be somewhere between 5 and 6 years old. So why don't we have exact preciseness like we did with the development of oral language or motor skills? This is due to there isn't one area of the brain called the written language area of the brain, like there is for motor skills and oral language. Written language is a human invention. It's something we created. It wasn't necessary until we made it necessary by recording a written history. So it is an integration of 3 different areas of the brain, the visual and auditory centers, and then also the motor center for enunciating or articulating those words that we read. The visual and the auditory is what I see. I connect to sound, which is the auditory, and then I blend those sounds together and call the word. So what would be the soft signs of a child who is not developing this in a typical fashion? This would be a child who struggles with something called phonological awareness, or the placement of sounds in words. So if you were to ask him or her, what is the beginning sound you hear in cat? They may not know what the beginning sound is, where that placement in the word is, or even if you just wanted to say the word cat. Now say it slowly. Cat. How many sounds did you hear? To the child who is atypical, it sounded like one sound or a unit versus 3 distinct human speech sounds. We, if we are typical, perceived with 3 distinct human ones. For the child who's atypical, it sounded like one running version of speech. This would also be a child then that when they do start to want to blend or read, struggle with keeping all of those sounds in order, attaching the right sound to the squiggle. And then more importantly, as they get a little bit older, we're into kindergarten, 1st grade, others are reading and they can call the word maybe today, but 30 minutes later in their next session, do not have memory for it and struggle with it
again. Another written language skill is writing. And so we start with pre-writing. The child is increasing their hand coordination from a whole hand grasp to using a pincer grasp. There's an entire sensorial curriculum in Montessori that helps the child with the development of the hand in preparation for writing. When the child begins to use some sort of writing instrument like a crayon or a pencil, they usually scribble on a page. But as their coordination becomes more proficient, they will be able to copy shapes and then begin to copy letters, simple words, phrases, simple sentences, and paragraphs. And then the student proceeds to creative writing, stories, and the usage of written language. This is a powerful look at written language. It's not all about reading, and it's not all about spelling. It's about the zenith of what a human brain can do, which is to take their oral language internal thoughts and get them out their motor channel and write them. What's critical with this is it's not just this hand, but it's what are the shapes of the letters that I see in my head to manufacture and put them on paper? And then, oh my goodness, what is the order of those letters? And then more importantly, do I get so lost in the replication of the order of those letters that I forget what I wanted to say? I'm trying to emphasize how so often we take that process for granted. But when you do a task analysis of everything that's required just to write a sentence, it can almost become overwhelming. Because for some, it progresses normally, but for the child at risk, it's very, very difficult. I almost can see this in their head going, I struggled enough with reading. Now you want me to put my thoughts on paper? You gotta be kidding me. So what does the Montessori environment do to help this child? Well, first of all, whatever school you're in, be it a standard school, public or private, or Montessori school, we know in that environment, statistically, that environment has 20% or 1 in 5 children with a learning difference. So no one is teaching perfect children. There are these children in that environment that need our help. One of the first things we do is simplify, simplify, simplify. Take the written language process, analyze it for each subtask, and direct teach each task. And so what you can see in these pictures is a spelling activity that didn't come out their motor channel. Instead, it's using letters called the movable alphabet. Joyce mentioned how all of those parts of our brain touch, and we need multisensory instruction. Imagine if you were given letters to manipulate in which you could hold in your hand an L, and then hold in your hand an O, and tactily, those shapes are completely different. You can almost discriminate them with your hands for what the eye may have difficulty discriminating or perceiving. And then as you notice, in rug, mug, and bug, a part of every word is constant, and that is ugh, so that we can master that unit and just blend one new element. But reading in a typical reader, it may be a 3-letter word, but the medial vowel changes, the beginning and the ending consonants change. But in this, we're taking it into sub-steps so that what was a challenge could be more accomplishable. And then the additional therapeutic strategies that we use, an oral language curriculum that emphasizes, like Montessori said, label, teach the names of things, teach the appropriate nomenclature. And then for a child with a learning difference, it is never too early to begin thinking differently about their written language instruction. Starting in the Montessori with the manipulatives and moving on to a more direct, explicit, multisensory reading therapy approach. Something similar to Orton-Gillingham, you may have heard of, and all of the programs that were using Orton-Gillingham as a base, sequential English education, alphabetic phonics, take flight. These are just a few to name.
Top. Ah. Ah.
Ah.
Very good. Now see if you can say the word and
Chop.
then bring down 1 stone for each sound in the word. Ah. Uh-huh. Very good. Let's do it one more time together. Ah. Good.
So typical development of attention, which is so critical in learning. We have to be able to sustain our attention on a short, interesting lesson. And most children can do that by 3 years of age. Because before that, from birth to about 2.5 to 3, the child has no inhibition control. They can't shut out anything. Every sight and sound and smell impinges on their brain with equal force. And so until they can focus and have selective attention, which develops by about 3 in the typically developing child, they are often distracted, inattentive, or hyperactive in behavior. As Joyce mentioned, this neurological shift is almost a miracle of the human brain, that those extra senses that were required to be almost on high alert are now not necessary beyond the age of 3, and the pruning begins to cut off all of those extra senses that we needed and to shape our focus. But what about the child? And you know them right now. This seems beyond the age of 3 to have difficulty with sustained eye contact, sustained attention. This can occur to look like inattentiveness, in which they always seem to be daydreaming or fidgeting with small objects, or going up to their room to get something very specific, but saying something different, and then you go into their room and they may be playing with an object that was not part of the direction. Of course, we know hyperactivity very well. This would be a child that seems to be driven by an internal motor, very physically engaged, always on the go. And then the child that is combined, which can sway back between different levels of arousal, between under aroused, which is inattentiveness, the daydreaming, the staring off, or higher arousal like hyperactivity. The tell here is they don't spend enough time in typical arousal. They're either high or they're low at the combined time. So what does Montessori, or an environment that is intended to teach development, do? Well, it directly teaches attention. That child in the earlier slide who was pouring, I mentioned, look at her eyes on her hand. Can you imagine an environment that has at its base, without any words needing to be provided, this idea of showing what attention looks like? If I said to you right now, you need to focus, as an adult, how would you describe what your body's doing when it's focused? Well, it's probably immobile. If there was something specific I wanted you to focus on, your attention, which is your body, is looking at that, free from any of those distractions of somebody walking by. How often do we tell a child to focus without direct teaching what that feels like and what that looks like? The word focus is ambiguous until it's directly taught, and the child in this picture is learning how to focus. He's engaged in a motor activity, which is a great stimulation of attention, but there's a boundary in which he's scrubbing the floor. And then the attention to task, eye on my hand, body facing the work. That is focus defined. Another challenge of attention is what Joyce referred to as executive functioning skills when she was talking about the first plane of development. Executive functioning is prioritizing, activating, choosing, following through. Imagine being in an environment similar to the one behind me with all these beautiful materials. How do you know what to choose? What choice should I make first? For the typical child, this is actually accomplished with ease. But for the atypical child who struggles with attention and executive functioning, they can wander the room, helpless, not knowing what to do. So imagine a to-do list. I make one every day. It's what helps me understand what I need to prioritize. What are the things that have a time element that I must get done today? So imagine a to-do list for a young child who struggles. It gives them the path to independence and choice that they so desperately want to make. So the fourth system we're going to talk about is the development of perception. So a typical child perceives gross sensory input, such as sounds, textures, smells, taste, from their early months of life. In development from birth to 3 years, the child becomes more able to perceive visual and auditory input and be able to discriminate between one sound and another, between one shape and another. From 3 to 6 years, the typical child can refine their discrimination from gross to finer and finer perceptual ability, as seen in the Montessori sensorial curriculum. So later, Amy will demonstrate the pink tower, one of the size sensorial curriculum, where each cube is 1 centimeter smaller than the other. This requires a great deal of fine discrimination, which is going to be necessary when they are discriminating between letters and sounds. So we start with the concrete and move toward the abstract. The area of Montessori's curriculum, Montessori being a developmental approach, recall, not a list of tasks, but that area of sensorial is used not only to train the senses, but it can be diagnostic in understanding the child's perception of their senses, which would be a perception of the visual input, auditory, gustatory, olfactory, and touch. So the pink tower that you'll see me model, I'm going to show what a misperception of the pink tower looks like. The pink tower is an ascension of 10 cubes, stratified from largest to smallest, with a 1 centimeter cube difference in size. For the typically developing child, they see that ascension or the gradation. For the child with perception that is atypical, they typically see the large and the smallest on top, but in the middle, that discrimination gets muddled, or what I call mushy in the middle. And you may see some cues out of place, but it will always end with the smallest on top. And that Montessori pedagogy is phenomenal in picking out those subtle differences. In the video, you'll see the difference or the mushy in the middle, but you'll also get to see a demonstration of how do you refine that when you perceive a problem. The thing that we love to do is take that challenge and work towards mastery, not just take the challenge and think it'll come, it'll just develop on its own. It is never too late to add direct instruction and task analysis of what you want them to do in order to achieve refinement. All right, as I mentioned before, here is the pink tower, the set of 10 cubes proceeding in a gradation from large to small.
The size or the change of the gradation is this exact cube, which is 1 centimeter cubed, is the difference in gradation. This is an activity that you would find in a Montessori 3 to 6-year-old classroom for 3 to 6-year-olds. 3-year-old children and 4-year-old children are commonly working with this activity. It looks great, doesn't it? You can see the ascension in every cube is just so. When I mentioned this, I said this is going to be a diagnostic tool for the teacher to see if there's any misperceptions in what would be called the least noticeable difference in size. So if I were to build this mirroring what may occur with a child who is showing some visual discrimination weaknesses, large they can always find, small they can always find. Because goodness, look at the difference between the two. They know it needs to end with this, and they have large, but now becomes the quagmire of which one comes next. So they may figure out this one. And as they build, they start visually eliminating, no, those ones are small. No, it ends with this one. And if I were to turn this just so you can see an angled approach, you can see what I'm calling it mushy in the middle. How do you remediate this? What is going to be your approach? This speaks to the McCarr training that Joyce will mention at the end of this video. McCarr stands for Montessori Applied to Children at Risk, and it's a way to seek that same version of accomplishment, yet refining that sense of visual perception at the same time. The first thing you would do is do what I call eliminate the variables. Instead of having 10, choose 3 and build using only 3. From largest to smallest and one in the middle. Once this is mastered, I'll use 4. These are not even on the work rug if you were working with this child. The only thing on the work rug would be these 4. And what you're doing is slowly pulling together that visual refinement so the eventuality of all 10 cubes is there.
So here are some of the reasons that we use the Montessori method in our early childhood program. Montessori method allows for individualization. Now that doesn't mean that every presentation is given one-on-one. Some are small group. It does mean that the teacher observes the child very carefully to see what he has understood from the lessons she has presented as he practices with the material. And that helps her with these notes to plan for what the next lesson will be. It takes a great deal of record keeping in order to individualize for each student. There is material and methods in the Montessori program for focusing attention. The teacher makes lessons with slowed hand movements. Slowed hand movements have been seen to help focus attention. Structure. This is a very structured classroom. It has to have a high degree of structure for children to be able to choose their own work when they can and have guidance by the teacher as needed. Every single lesson is presented for teaching whatever that lesson is to convey, and it teaches organization. How do you go about a learning task in an organized way? What are the steps? How do you prioritize? What do I do first, second, third to be successful with this work? Gross and fine motor development are worked on because Montessori said that movement is learning for children up to 2 years of age, and for many, even after that. So that gross motor development that we looked at earlier is important in the movement of the child around the classroom, and the fine motor development that is seen in working with the fine motor development works and lessons. As Amy covered thoroughly, oral language development is embedded in every single lesson, expanding the child's vocabulary. And written language development is done according to best practice, using the beautiful Montessori materials combined with multisensory structured language approaches. Since some of these children have attention problems and oral language problems, they may have more social skill problems, learning to get along, share, wait, and communicate with other children. So a specific program that we have added to the Montessori classroom is called Choices, helping the children through direct explanations of appropriate and inappropriate social interaction. Probably one of the most important things in the Montessori classroom is the highly prepared environment in which the teacher has analyzed exactly what needs to be on the shelves for the children, each material fitting their hand and being of a size they can work with, being highly organized into areas of the curriculum: practical life, sensorial, oral language, written language, math, and all the cultural subjects, which include history, geography, and the sciences. And in addition to these, art and music and motor skills. So that this is a very complete classroom. And all of the works are multisensory. And Montessori said that the hand is the instrument of the brain. So when a child can put their hands on concrete materials, which help them understand abstract concepts, learning takes place. What other therapeutic strategies are necessary? So the analytical observations based on the science of learning is very important. And that means that the teacher doesn't just present a lesson robotically. She presents it and then carefully watches the child when it is their turn to repeat the lesson, to determine through her analysis what he is understanding and what he is not understanding. The teacher is going to have to be in the learning environment of an at-risk child much more frequently than with the more self-directed typical learner. Presentations, as we've said, can be broken down into very small sequential steps in difficulty, both with the amount of materials and the steps in the lesson, which is very important in matching the lesson to the child's development. A teacher of children with these types of difficulties, especially attention challenges, needs to understand that she and the student are partners in sustaining his attention, that it is a physical neurological challenge for him to sustain attention, and that she may have to call him back to the lesson with eye contact, with her voice, with saying things like, look, or John, look here. Repeated presentations of classroom structure with clear limits and privileges and boundaries must be specific. They give children a sense of security. And direct teaching of the work cycle. Some children who are self-directed amaze us by choosing the appropriate work for them, even without our guidance. And others, especially those at risk, need much more help in learning a cycle of work. There's an enhancement of social skills and interpersonal relationships in this Montessori classroom where the emphasis is on respect. The children respecting each other, the teacher respecting the children respecting the teacher, and everyone respecting the materials with which we learn. Mention the direct teaching of social skills and social values with the Choices program. Modeling appropriate behaviors. The teacher does not talk across the room or raise her voice if she wants the children to do the same. Providing an environment of encouragement, a deep emphasis on failure to encourage the child who can become so discouraged if not receiving support for their effort. And so when a student has completed something, you can thank them for their effort or validate that their work is correct. So how can schools help parents and teachers of students with learning differences? There are some critical things that have to be done by a school to provide help for the children that are in that school. So provide a parent checklist, which can give the school a developmental history of the child. Provide a teacher checklist, which can give the teacher and administrator a profile of the child as a learner and whether they are developing typically or there are some areas that are not yet developing typically. Provide regular informational meetings for parents. Provide regular and ongoing professional development for teachers. How could you expect a teacher to help a child with learning differences if they do not understand what these learning differences are and therefore what the characteristics are and what the children need? So each school should set a support team with the administrator, a representative from each level of the school, parent reps, specialist personnel that might come into the school, like LD specialist or speech language pathologist. And these people together can create the plan for students who have a language learning, attentional, or behavioral challenge within that school. So all of these things are being proactive instead of reactive. Every summer at Shelton, we have a course called MACAR, Montessori Applied to Children at Risk. And so we welcome teachers to come to this 10-day course in which we talk about in much more detail how to meet the needs of the child who is at risk for a learning difference or has been diagnosed with a learning difference. This summer, it will be July 12th through 22nd. Dr. Sylvia Richardson and I wrote a book, Montessori Strategies Applied to Children at Risk for Learning Differences. So if you want more information, this book is available through Parent Child Press and electronically through Amazon. Amy and I thank you for being with us in this presentation, and we certainly hope it has been helpful. And we're ready to take any questions that you have at this time. After the question and answer period, if you wish to click on a link, you may see a tour of the Shelton School. Thank you.
Well, greetings to you all. So I have been managing the Q&A chat box and have not seen any questions from any participants yet. We'll give it a few more moments to see if some questions are risen, but at this time, there have not been any to put in front of the group.
So Amy, we might want to explain how they have teachers or friends that want to see this but were unable to be with us this morning, how they can watch this later.
Absolutely. So our host, if Kyle is right now recording it, and if you had registered for this, you will automatically get a recording of this. We will be looking to see about putting it on our website as a posted link for the presentation, not so much the chat box, but the presentation that we recorded. We actually do have a question, our first one. Is there a formal test for my 6-year-old to take to determine if she has dyslexia or a learning difference? That's an excellent question.
So Amy, are you going to answer that, or do you want me to?
Sure. Why don't you take that one, Joyce, and answer it just in general terms, but more specifically for that 6-year-old diagnosing?
Yes. Yes. We can screen children at 5 or 6 years of age. Before that, we just are noticing the characteristics, and we are working with the child on any weaknesses or gaps that we see that have been developed. There are screening tests, and then there are full evaluations. Shelton has an evaluation center. The director is Dr. Laurie Ames, and they see children and adolescents and adults of all ages. And so if you wish to email Dr. Ames with your interest in finding out more about evaluation, you can email her at lames, AMES, at shelton.org. She'll be glad to answer questions for you. And I certainly will also. My email is jpickering@shelton.org. And Amy, is it still Kelton on your email?
Yeah, so it's still Kelton until my Social Security gets updated.
So
So it's still akelton@shelton.org.
Amy's been recently married, so.
Yes. All right. Two other good questions. This question is, how would this approach work in the middle school years and high school years? And I'd be happy to answer that. So with me being the principal of upper elementary, which is 3rd, 4th, and 5th, I'm kind of that conduit going into those middle school years. Really what it is, it's about the tenets. It's not so much about the precise material. It's the tenets of eliminate the variables, like you saw what I did with the pink tower, which would be to shorten the work segment. So there's some tenets on facilitating learning for a learning different student. The tenet of show everything you're going to do in a silent form first, and then scaffold and add language. And when you add language, be very specific. Students with learning differences tend to get very overwhelmed by elongated explanations using your oral language. As a matter of fact, a parallel to this is I went into teaching for 2 reasons. I like to babysit and I like to talk. Well, being a teacher and working with students with with learning differences, you can talk too much. One of the critical functions in working with a child with a learning difference is observe more, talk less. And when you do talk, make sure it is direct and explicit. So really it's about the tenets. As a matter of fact, June Shelton, who our school is founded by, was a Montessorian, was a speech language therapist. And the tenets of our school run parallel to those, or tightly woven with Montessori, which is observe the child, teach to their developmental level, be very specific with the language that you do add, and always ensure respect and dignity. So you'll see in our high school, though it doesn't look like a Montessori environment with the shelves and all those beautiful materials, the tenets run through. Another question that I'd love to.
Amy, before you go on, I just want to reinforce that throughout the school, that philosophy of Montessori of respect for the child as an individual learner, whether they're at lower school, upper elementary, middle, or high school is very, very critical to the work of Shelton. And a second tenet that Amy alluded to is use multisensory teaching as much as possible because learning through all of our senses is important.
Absolutely. I kind of follow Dr. Seuss's ability to find kitschy rhymes to teach different concepts to children. And so I'll say, what I don't understand, put in my hands. If you can remember that, embody or use that full body capability that you have before you to help grasp a concept. And then a final question for the day, and this is a good one, Joyce, for you to answer. We know that Montessori is multi-age grouping, but at Shelton, do we have a version of multi-age grouping? Are there some younger children in the classrooms with some older children? And what do those age divisions look like?
That's a wonderful question. Yes, we do use multi-age grouping. It's not always exactly the same as a traditional Montessori school because when a child enters Shelton, we have some screening to get a profile of the child as a learner. And the developmental level is much more important than the chronological age. For example, you may have a 3-year-old who is at a typical development for 3-year-olds in some scales, but for example, may be in oral language at an 18-month-old level. So we look very carefully at each child's developmental levels before we set up a classroom and group children there for their needs and the abilities of their teachers to meet all those individual needs. But you would usually find about a 3-year age span in our multi-age classrooms.
Very good. At Shelton, we have 4 divisions of our school. We have lower school, which is early childhood through 2nd grade. That employs Montessori. Early childhood is 3, 4, and approximately 5-year-olds. The next grade level, if you could call that, is called pre-primary, which is 5 and 6-year-olds, those that are scaffolding or on the hump between early childhood and a full kindergarten experience. And then you have primary, which is a multi-age grouping of 1st and 2nd graders. So typically it would be 6 1st graders, 6 2nd graders. My division is upper elementary, which is 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. We call 3rd, 4th as a combined elementary because we employ the Montessori materials and pedagogy in those classrooms. Similar to primary, elementary is about 6 3rd graders, 6 4th graders, all in a classroom and making up 12 students. And then 5th grade is a step beyond Montessori where we're going with that pure age or stage of 5th grade and using it as more of a transition to a middle school climate or atmosphere. So Montessori goes for us from early childhood through 4th, and it's as pure approach or with the didactic materials. But as we spoke earlier, it's embedded and it's immutable to Shelton. We are the tenets of Montessori.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to add is that if you're thinking, how can they combine 3rd and 4th graders? We're only using those terms because it's part of traditional education to understand what grade you're in, but we're looking at each child's developmental levels. And so you would have in that classroom some children who are 3rd graders by their placement, but they are at the 4th or 5th grade level in math. So the teacher is trained across grade levels so she can answer the needs of those children who are below grade level and those who are above grade level and those that are on grade level. Because with children with learning differences, they rarely have a learning challenge in every area, but in specific areas. For example, the dyslexic child has difficulty with learning reading and spelling and written expression.
Well, we are so pleased you could join us today. This is a presentation that Joyce and I look forward to every January to get this message out into the greater parent and education community. We will be also sharing a link to a video that's a tour of our new campus. Shelton not only made the decision to open during COVID, but we opened in a brand new facility. So we were definitely integrating a lot of new policies and procedures that come just with a new campus and now COVID too. But we love our new campus. And so we have put together a tour of that we use to show our parents and other friends of Shelton what inside of Shelton looks like. So we will send that also to you as a link. All right, Joyce, I think that finishes us for today.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let us know if we can be of any help.
Bye. Thank you.